Hey Juno, thank you for coming on, man. I really appreciate it, and it's a pleasure to meet you.
No, thank you all so much. Again, it's an honor to be participating. It's a wonderful project.
Thank you so much. I wanted to start with your childhood. Maybe tell us a little bit of what that was like, and then how it ultimately went to shape your life's work.
Well, I was born Dominican Republic. Again, very at a strange period, Dominican history during what people call a soft dictatorship. The time that I was born, there was an enormous amount of kind of economic upheaval, an enormous amount of political repression from the U.S.-backed government, primarily directed at young people. My family immigrated from the Dominican Republic, partially as a consequence of both of these factors. When I was 6 years old, I just turned six, was about to turn six. We're a poor family in the Dominican Republic, and we were a very poor family in the United States. And probably what's most sort of like when I think of my childhood, Dominican Republic and the United States, I had a very difficult father, kind of a very difficult father. My father was a kind of person you definitely don't want to have as a dad. Very authoritarian, very violent, very repressive, very absent, very abusive. Kind of fulfilled all the stereotypes of the Caribbean, the Afro-Caribbean father. Always had other women on the side, really didn't spend any energy hiding it. There was a lot of, as you can imagine, both psychic and sort of financial unease. And so, as a young person, it was a very unsettled and nervous, very nervous condition. When I think of that, I think the poverty sucked. I think the kind of racism that we encountered in the United States at the time was brutal, but I think it would have been perhaps, at least I fantasize that it would have been far easier had the family situation been a little bit more supportive, a little bit more humane. Yeah. And so, I'm sure if in those days I had access to the kind of sort of resources I have now when I was a kid, I would have been diagnosed very, very quickly as, suffering from depression. And that's, those are kind of the broad outlines, in a kind of a 3-minute kind of snapshot.
Wow! And how did you keep dreaming big, and stay focused on what you wanted to do, coming from a very unprivileged background, being poor, coming to the United States when you were six, and having that situation with your father? How did you keep your dreams alive, and how did you not fall into despair?
Well, no, I don't know if I didn't fall into despair. I think I'd spent a lot of time despairing. And, what was interesting is, as it was coming up, was that, I was a pretty bright kid, a kid who was kind of nerdy, really into reading, and, which counted for a lot in those days. Sort of was unusual in the community that I was growing up in. I found that, I was very lucky. I had good ass friends who had different lives and different backgrounds, who were able to help, able to kind of provide other models. I had a wonderful family friend, Egyptian immigrant, came from a very supportive family, a family that really pushed him academically, a family that encouraged me academically. And, what my family couldn't give me directly, other people were kind of giving these auxiliary supplies of sort of encouragement, auxiliary supplies of support. And that wasn't small, man. That wasn't small. In fact, this family used to be the one that would take me to the library. I remember my first dictionary ever was a gift from this family. When I think about being a writer and the first tool a writer needs, of course, pen, paper would be great. But once you get to that, back in those days before we were all online, the dictionary was just absolutely essential. When I took my first step to be a writer, this family was there guiding that. And I was very fortunate, and I think, again, in certain ways, I didn't kind of have great luck, being born poor, kind of growing up in a really racist part of New Jersey. But I was very, very fortunate with some of my friends, very fortunate.
They gave you this sense of community, belonging, and guidance, I feel.
Yeah, no, it was nice to be kind of, as we say, it's nice to be acknowledged and it's nice to be resonated with. I mean, that's one of the things that happens if you're kind of thinking about being something that there isn't much alignment in your family or in your community. I was bookish. I really wanted to be an intellectual. I wanted to be a writer. Let me tell you, there was not a lot of examples, not a lot of models in the community I grew up in. In fact, people kind of thought I was insane. It seemed completely unlikely. Nobody read. Nobody was interested in books. I didn't see anybody really carrying books around. People were like, hey, who in the world wants to read about anything that, has to do with our community, has to do with our lives? And, in general, that wasn't exactly the most convivial context in which to dream of being a writer, to dream of being a Dominican writer, writing about Dominican things. But hey, man, the great thing about being young is it doesn't take a lot of encouragement. That's one of the most wonderful things, is that a little encouragement in a context like this goes a really long way, really, really long way. And, a lot of times I would get, fall into kind of gloomy episodes, depressive episodes, episodes that were psychologically very difficult. And again, I got to tell you, man, if it wasn't for my friends, I'm not sure that I would be able to, I would have been as resilient, or I would have been able to snap out as quickly.
Thank God for your friends, because you've done amazing things. And is writing something you always knew you wanted to do? How did that love for the written word start?
Yeah, I wonder about that sometimes, because how a thing develops, sometimes it can be very clear. I have friends of mine who are like, hey, man, the first time I got on a soccer field, I knew. I just knew, I knew. And other friends of mine who were like, yeah, I'm a big time lawyer now, but I only kind of decided to be a lawyer after I graduated from college. It was like something that came late, and they themselves are not like claiming it was some, kind of word of God or some massive inspiration. I think for me, the path to becoming a writer began with this enormous love that I evolved for reading. Yeah, I mean, most people they fall in love with music, they fall in love with sport, they'll fall in love with, I don't know, some kind of hobby. Well, for me, it was like I fell in love with reading, man. Part of it was escaping from my family. My family was like wild, man. Volume set to 13 all day long. You couldn't, I always used to joke around in my family, you couldn't cross the living room without some bullshit or nonsense popping off. It was just like super dramatic. And I think books were kind of a great escape for me, great escape. And they were, for a kid like me, because on the one hand, sure, I wanted to escape, but on the other hand, I wanted to escape from, but I also wanted to escape to. I was really curious. I had already left one world and came to another. I was an immigrant kid. For some people, that's enough to knock them off of travel for the rest of their lives. They're like, yo, I don't want to know shit about the world. I don't want to know shit about travel. I want to stay in my neighborhood. I want to stay in my routines. Exact opposite happened to me, man. I got on that plane once, and it awakened in me an awareness of how big the world was, a tremendous curiosity of the complexity and the kind of the adventure that the world could possibly represent. You know, as a poor kid, certainly coming to America and coming into a very poor, difficult neighborhood wasn't exactly the adventure I was looking forward to. But, there were some angles there that delighted me and, thrilled me. And so I kind of was really curious about the world. Now, you got to understand, these days, let's say you're some Dominican kid from Villajuana and you are curious about the world. You pull out your damn phone and you go and look at videos of people doing stuff in the place you want to be at. You can even find live cams, right? Like, that wasn't the case, man. Our entire social media, our entire YouTube, all the kind of visual tutorials, video tutorials, all of that was books, man. And so if you were curious about the world, you had to read. And I was curious about the world. And so books were, they were this escape, but they also kind of opened up. They were a place for my curiosity to reside. And I think those two things together pushed and sort of led me towards writing, led me towards books. Because, when you love a thing enough, eventually you start thinking that like, hey, man, maybe I want to participate. I loved books so damn much. And I thought like, hey, man, I love these stories. I love writing. You're at school. People are like, yo, what are you going to be? You've got your friends saying, I want to be this. I want to be that. You have no goddamn idea. And then you start looking around, you start saying, well, I mean, I think if you've got some good guidance, you got the space for it, you got some, some ideas, usually the best thing to say is like, well, what the hell do I love the most that's within reach, right? Because I could love basketball all I want, but if I'm 5'3", gonna be a problem, It's got to be, the ability that kind of rare ability to have a dream, but to also be able to understand, that even with dreams, there's certain limitations. And I was like, you know what? Books are going to be hard. Writing is going to be hard for this immigrant kid, but it felt possible. It felt like doable, sort of like being 5'8", a basketball player. It was like, it's not going to be like easy, but I think I might be able to pull something out. And that helped, man. That helped. My love of the game of reading, pushed me towards writing. And probably the third piece, which I haven't mentioned, is like many immigrant kids, I came up in an ethos of work that was, I would never wish it on any of my children. We all want our kids to be hardworking, but I wouldn't want them to work the way I worked growing up, man. That's like, whew. It's not only back-breaking, and I could testify having a back that has been broken up. There's only back-breaking. It's a lot when you're that young. But I grew up with a whole bunch of work ethic. I grew up with a whole bunch of, capacity for work. And so, I had this dream, and fortunately, I had the muscles that allowed me to kind of like pursue it a little bit. A lot of us have dreams, and we don't develop the muscles that allow us to pursue it. And, usually the dream is the easy part. The muscles, it's the hard part. And I was able to kind of develop both, at the same time.
Work ethic and love for the craft. That's great advice. Yeah. Why did you decide to focus on the immigrant experience and play around with race and sex and lust and love? Why did you decide to focus on that area?
I mean, I think first and foremost, nobody was doing it. I mean, as an artist, if you want to be an artist, you sort of are not trying to repeat. I think that there's an enormous amount of, there's an enormous amount of artistry that goes in to tributes, right? You don't want to like underplay how much artistry goes into a tribute. Let's say you're cosplaying. That's an incredibly creative on multiple levels, right? But the thing about sort of like, say, being a writer is that you kind of trying to find something that nobody's done before at all. You know, you're trying to find a space. And certainly in English, there wasn't a lot of writing about the Dominican community. I felt like I was somewhat qualified to speak about this tiny aspect of the Dominican community. Second of all, I mean, you know, as a community, we're completely criminalized. I mean, I grew up at a time when Dominicans and selling crack were synonymous, you know, completely criminalized. You know, we were not given stories where we saw ourselves, you know, having families that were normal, where we saw ourselves being in love, where we saw ourselves being sexual. You know, everything was being criminal. We were always criminalized. And so I thought, like, hey, man, this wouldn't be a bad intervention. You know, and when you're a young person growing up in a world where you're dating and all that wild stuff that happens when you're in college, with the way people party, you know, it just felt like, hey, man, nobody's talking about the way that we live these experiences. So it seemed like an interesting avenue. And I think I started mostly because I thought, hey, this is a place where I could, you know, I could say something useful, something new. And then, you know, in the process, you begin to discover that you might have some deeper things to say than just, you know, no one's been here, so I can put my tent up. You begin to look around and you begin to say, you know what, there's other things, deeper matters that I could engage in. And I think that's what happens. You know, I think the point of a lot of the work we do when we're young is that, you know, it's an exploration. You know, you don't want to forestall too early what it is and who you are. I mean, I had a conversation with high school senior daughter of a friend of mine. She was like, oh, I want to be a writer. Like, I want to go to these colleges to pursue this stuff. And in the back of my head, I was like, you know, I was trying to be helpful, but at the back of my head, I'm thinking like, man, that is so young to be so sure about what the heck you want to do. Part of me thinks that, like, you know, part of the whole process of the neoliberal university is that it's like a sorting hat from Harry Potter. It wants to slot you into your house as soon as possible. It doesn't want you to explore your house. Because sure, you want to be a writer when you're in high school, but I mean, there's a chance that there's other dreams and other paths as well as this path available to you. But if you kind of foreclose the process of exploration, you're never going to discover them. And I think that what was useful for me was that, listen, I didn't realize that I was going to be a writer until very late in college. I actually had picked up a bunch of different paths first, and I was fortunate to be able to explore them. On one hand, I was thinking of being a lawyer. You know, I started taking government classes and political science, thinking that would help me and that would shape me. You know what? I was going to be terrible at it. Had to put it down, right? Another time later on, I was like, hey, I want to be a kind of a historian. I was thinking, hey, maybe be a history teacher, maybe get some graduate classes in history. History really excited me. But, you know, I kind of began to realize that shit was going to be a dead end too. And I was going to suck a little bit too much to make it viable. But I was glad that I was able to go on these journeys. And had I been asked to sort of pick Gryffindor for, you know, Slytherin when I was in high school, they wouldn't have discovered who in the world I was going to be. You know, the problem is you should think less of life as, you know, the Harry Potter sorting hat, where, you know, the sooner you know what house you belong to, the better. And more like, you know what, I think you should try all the houses if you can. Now, not everybody can. I understand that. You know, there's a lot of pressure on young people. College is incredibly expensive for them to justify it. So they're being told, hey, man, make a decision early, make a decision early, make a decision early. And that sucks, you know, it really sucks.
Yeah, that exploration is probably the most important part of college, really getting to know who you are and who you want to be. And most people simply don't know. That's why high school at least should try to foster that curiosity and that spirit of exploring.
Well, one hopes, you know. It's just hard. Everyone's got so much pressure. There's no time, and there's no money, and schools are under funded. It's pain. The thing about being young right now is I think we have to understand the context in which we're sort of coming up. It's a neoliberal context. It's a context where, this sort of economic lunacy in which we reside is really attempting to limit outcomes and to transform people into neoliberal subjects. And, that's very, very limiting. So what it wants is it wants people who don't explore much. It wants people who think of everything along the terms of, kind of the cash nexus, can we monetize? Can we privatize everything? It's difficult, it's very, very difficult, I think, as a young person to get the education that you deserve, to get the sort of the life path that you deserve. You often have to resist, the commandments of the society in ways that are bigger than the ones that you think that you're having to resist, in general.
And because we have this fast-paced environment, I feel that sometimes art is not valued as much, or people don't see the value behind it because they don't see the profit behind it right away. So what would you really say is the value behind art, artists, and the written word in general?
This is a tough one because I understand. I mean, when you're, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100,000 plus dollars in debt, talking about art seems it's a little bit of a luxury because you've got to earn the money to pay this back. When your family's so broke that they're having problems paying the rent and you're going to be the person who helps them, talking about how you're going to pursue your performance career sometimes feels a little irresponsible. It's a difficult context out there. Yet, ultimately, what can I tell you? I mean, you have to live the life that you have to live. And if you're like me, my plan was always and my plan is to have a regular job and then do my art. There's nothing unusual for that. I mean, shoot, most of the parents I know have 2 jobs. So I figured I have one job that was kind of hellish and one job that was the job of my life, my calling. This is a reality if you're not rich. This is a reality if you're not elite. This is a reality if you're not lucky. That oftentimes you've got to chisel your art out from the hard, cold stone of our realities, which doesn't give us a lot of time or space for it. And yet, many of us couldn't survive these lives without our art. Many of us wouldn't be fulfilled without our art. Art is no different than love. Could we, sure, is having a roof over your head important? Yeah. Is having an income important? Yeah. It's paying, your financial, the debts you owe for your schools. Yeah. But on top of that, you need other things to survive. Love is one of them. Community, family, things that they haven't figured out a way to completely monetize them. And art, which, art is problematically been sort of colonized by neoliberalism and capitalism, but, there's still a lot of room for it. And I think that was the thing, is that ultimately, if you have this passion, you can do everything you want to deny it, but it's going to return to you one way or the other. So if you want to be an artist and you're in a situation where you do not have the kind of privilege or the elitism of the 1 or the 10%, then you start having to be very practical and very strategic. You look for a job that allows you to pursue your art. And one never knows the lives that you are going to touch with your art. Ultimately, I'm like 51 years old, man, and life is short. 30 was a blink. College was 2 blinks. Not far from now, one passes from the world. And so, what do you leave behind? Well, one of the dreams is that as an artist, that you leave behind that kind of transformational archive. Yeah. The ways that your work has changed people, even if it's 2 people, that remains. It's an archive that lives on in the world. And I don't think that's a bad legacy to have. I mean, really die and what you have a house and a summer house you leave to your kids. Okay, that's one legacy. I don't knock it. I wish I had it, but that you've been able to help people's lives, you've been able to inspire them and nurture them and to give them shelter in these difficult times. It's not a bad thing either. It's not a bad thing at all.
It's a very beautiful thing. It's a very, very beautiful thing. And I noticed that you call it your calling, your passion. When did you realize that this was your passion? And are you writing? I've noticed also that highly successful people like yourself, they always do what they do for a higher calling or a higher purpose. So with that being said, I wanted to ask you, why do you do what you do? Why do you write, basically?
Well, I'll take the first part of it, right? I'll be honest with you. Again, no matter how much I loved reading and I wanted to participate, I didn't know that I wanted to be a writer until I published my first book. I'm a lot more ambivalent around my talent than I let on. I think every time I write a book, I kind of try to get out of the game because the game for me is too difficult in my heart. It demands too much of me, but it's sort of like a bad, heist movie. It always drags me back. One last job. One last job, man. Come on, don't retire. One last job. That's what these books are like, So, it wasn't until I published my first book. I remember, again, I was going to be just a couple years. I was like 27 years old, published my first book, and it came in and, sitting there looking at it, and I put it away. And, a couple months of living with the book on the shelf, it dawned on me that, like, oh my God, I realized, wow, this is the thing I care about. Shit, I'm not going to be able to avoid it for now. And it was a tough realization. And again, you have to square it with, there was another side of me that was deeply passionate about reading, deeply passionate about writing. But there was a part of me that was hoping to God this wasn't going to be my path, because this thing is really, really difficult. Why do I do it? In spite of the fact that it's extraordinarily difficult? Because I think sometimes we're called to do very difficult things. I think sometimes we're called to live lives that are challenging. To live lives that aren't all love and all joy. I have friends of mine who, their art is the thing that they love the most. The life of the artist is the thing they love the most. They would never give their art up for anything. Let me tell you, if there was an angel and said, "Hey, would you give up your art?" And I will snap my fingers. I'm like, get snapping right away. Because this stuff is difficult. This stuff isn't easy for me, And I'm not just saying it. I promise you. I think there's a whole tradition of artists to whom wrestle with the thing they do. And I'm not special and I'm not new. It's ambivalence. But ultimately, when I think about what keeps me going is a sense of, a deeper responsibility, a deeper obligation that, in these difficult places that I must enter to write, the depths that I have to dive down to return with the news that I want to share in my work. There's not a lot of people who can hold their breath as long as I can. There's not a lot of people who can go that deep, down that dark, and to, withstand that cold. And when you are given these talents, or when you develop them, eventually you realize there's going to be some responsibility. I have things that I can do that perhaps no one else can. Now, it doesn't mean I'm the only writer. 1 billion cubed writers could write what I'm writing. But in the specificity of what I'm writing, the absolute kind of molecular granularity, there's not going to be anyone like you or anyone like person X or fulano. And so I feel like there's something that I can bring to this world that is useful, And therefore, I need to suck it up. I need to grit my teeth. I need to have mis ovarios bien puesto and meter mano, because I need to get to work and see where this will take me. And I think that that's part of it. If it was only love, it would be easy. If it was only the passion, it would be easy. But there's also a deeper sense of obligation that, and sometimes there's something that we're here to do. And it doesn't matter that it's hard. It doesn't matter that it's not pleasant. We're here to do it, and we should do it with a certain amount of grace.
And you are doing it very well. When you talk about diving deeply into that hole, what does the hole mean?
Well, I just think it's a place where as a community, and by a community, I just mean the community I came up with, and not the whole universal community of Afro-Dominicans, Caribbeans, Latinas, it's just, there's places my community doesn't want to look. There's conversations my community has been taught that it shouldn't have. There are silences that are choking us to death. There's silences and sort of kind of habits which have never served us and are continually not serving us. There are questions that need asking, right? And so I think that that's that. I think that there are histories and places that need to be explored and silences that need to be, detonated. And it's not easy, and very little is easy. Shoot, my mother works, looking after old people. That's harder than what I do. But if, she's got the strength and the courage to do that, I got the strength and the courage to do this. Believe me, when you're an artist and you bring to the world news of itself, people are not happy with you. People, people want you to reassure them. They want you to flatter them. They want consolation. This is why artists are always, being, tortured and disappeared and driven out and, marginalized, ignored, trivialized, because artists hold up, we make mirrors. And these mirrors that we hold up to our communities and to our world are not always welcomed. And certainly not now, in the time of the kind of the filter selfie. The mirrors of the artists are even less welcome. Or the mirrors of the artists are even less welcome.
They show us some dark parts of our human nature that we don't want to be revealed. And I know you like talking about topics that are not really brought up in a normal conversation, and I really admire you for that. And talking about courage and being courageous, I saw something that you wrote for the New Yorker, and you talked about an experience, a traumatic experience that you had when you were 8 years old. And I'm wondering if you could maybe share that. If not, it's completely fine, up to you, and maybe give some advice to someone that might have undergone something similar.
I wrote an essay for the New Yorker called "The Silence" about my experience of being a child rape survivor. Rape is, again, one of those great silences in our community, certainly is in the Caribbean community, certainly is the community that I grew up in. There's certainly more resources now than there's ever been for people to deal with these kind of traumas. I think that, I know for a fact it's probably was one of the hardest things that I've had to deal with in my life. Made a lot of things difficult for me. That kind of, the lasting scars of that kind of violence, of that kind of violation. But I do think that we're fortunate that there's more resources than there was in my time, and certainly I think that if one finds himself with, kind of unprocessed trauma, it doesn't have to be sexual. It can be unprocessed trauma that sort of is just weighing you down. I think fortunately we're in a place where you don't have to completely come at it from a place where this would strike anyone as alien. The idea that, therapeutic approaches help, the idea that one should find a trusted person to bear witness, that one should attempt a process of healing, a process of metabolizing the trauma. Again, when I was young, this would have been an impossibility. If someone had brought all this stuff up, people would have been like, "Nah, I'm not crazy. I don't know what you're talking about. That's for crazy people." Fortunately, things have really changed and things have gotten a lot better. I think the hardest thing with any trauma is how lonely these traumas make us feel. I think a lot of times if we're feeling an enormous amount of loneliness, if we're often, consumed by loneliness, if we're like in a party and we feel alone, if we're with our family and we feel perpetually alone, there's a lot of reasons that could be. But I think one that's worth addressing or worth sort of being in dialogue with yourself is asking, are there any deep-seated traumas that you haven't been able to process? And, I never even thought that there was any deep-seated traumas. This had happened to me when I was a child and I put it away, didn't think of it. I never thought it was any problem, even as it was slowly devouring my life and kind of slowly putting holes through my heart. It wasn't until much later that I actually began to ask myself very important questions. And often, it's hard for people who've suffered to be able to admit that we've suffered. I think that's one of the most damaging aspects of traumatic experience. First, there's the injury itself of the trauma, and then there's the silence that kind of evolves out of the trauma, that gets provoked out of the trauma, which is just hideous, absolutely hideous. Again, I cannot encourage enough people to remember that, whether one is an activist or one seeking to heal, whatever you are, wherever you are, community is the best answer. Try to find community. Try to develop in yourself a sense of compassion. Compassion is so difficult. We live in a time where compassion has been exiled. We could make a dozen million arguments about why we're in the political situation we are now, one night before election day, after 4 years of the country being severely damaged on every level, our institutions being ravaged. And I think part of the reason we're in the situation we're in, it's such a polarized situation, is because compassion is just no longer considered valuable. It's almost impossible to get likes and retweets when it comes to compassion. That's not what works in a social media economy. Going after people, being fucked up, making absurd little jokes, that flies. Well, compassion doesn't fly. Therefore, the algorithm doesn't encourage it, and certainly isn't being encouraged by the large society. Look at our president. The least compassionate human being, and to say that is quite a kind of a distinction. And so therefore I would say, if you're suffering, try to build community, try to find people, use whatever resources you can, ask people, and then try to develop a practice of compassion. First of all, the first question you have to ask yourself is, do you even have an operational definition for compassion? You don't know how many seniors at university I have who don't even have a very good sense of what compassion really means. And how can you practice compassion if you don't even have a definition for it? And so some of these elementary moves, then they sound ridiculous, but they're a good beginning. They're a good beginning.
Could you describe it for us? Could you use a beautiful definition of compassion?
Do I have to? Can people just look it up? I think it would be great if people look it up. But look, I won't cheat you. I won't cheat you. I just, there's a part of me that's a teacher to the core, and of course I'm like, I'll look it up. But look, there's there's kind of sympathy, there's empathy, right? When you feel, right, or you can imagine other people suffering. Compassion is when you can imagine and you can feel other people suffering, and you want to do something about it, right? Compassion invites action. It invites sort of kind of responsible behavior. Compassion towards yourself, right, is all compassion is always surrounded by this idea of generosity, right? A prosecutor is not compassionate. A person who's looking for excuses to hate you is not compassionate. That's not compassion, right? If you're always mad at yourself for failing, that's not compassion. Compassion is forgiving. Compassion is generous, right? And that's the spirit with which you approach things, right? And then you want to make things better for yourself, right? But you don't make things better for yourself by being mean and cruel. So let's say I'm a procrastinator, right? I'm a procrastinator. Well, one is going to approach procrastination certainly more successfully if one is first compassionate. I mean, what? You're going to tell yourself, you suck. Come on, let's do this. I don't know, my dude. I'm not sure that's going to damn work. Maybe it worked for a short while, but it's not going to work forever.
Love for yourself and love for the people around you and empathy. Definitely.
Yeah, a sense of compassion, a sense of generosity, and then a desire to act, to do something about it, right? To take measures of remediation, right? Because a lot of times we have sympathy for, let's say we're a procrastinator, we'll have empathy for ourselves. We're like, oh, I feel bad, I'm a procrastinator. But there's no activity, there's no action there. Compassion would be like, you know what? You're okay. You're beautiful. This is out of some issue, deeper issue. Let's do one small thing that we can agree, one tiny thing to move this along a little bit better. Doesn't have to be big. And if we fail, let's not get mad at ourselves. Let's try again. Let's enlist some resources. Let's get some friends to help us. Let's not do this alone. Right? The other thing about compassion is that it's collective. It's not about isolating yourself.
And lastly, I want to ask you, here in the Rebound community, we really believe that embracing and learning from setbacks just has a lot of gives us an opportunity to learn and an opportunity to grow. What's one of the most important teachings that you've gotten from one of your life's setbacks?
I really believe it. I just think, there's all these different sayings from different countries. But I think that ultimately what you lose in the fire, you will find in a different form in the ashes. And if you think of it in those terms, you have to understand the fire is always coming for us. Our house is always going to burn down. We're always going to lose our job. The person that we love and probably took for granted is always going to leave us. Family members are always going to get mad at us. The fire is always coming for us. And the idea of this idea that, what we lose in the fire, we'll find in another form of the ashes, is this idea of, again, that one needs to be resilient. And by resilient, we mean that we can imagine the future. We have no ability to imagine the future. So we should not assume just because the fire took our house down, that that's all there is for us. We have to believe that things will get better, and the only way that things get better is, by a little progressive attitude, a little progressive activity, and a kind of a spirit of optimism. even if you're down and beaten up and you just feel like, giving in, as they say, fake it till you make it. Fake that spirit of optimism till it kindles inside of you.
I've had an amazing time talking to you,
so much.
Junot. And is there any last words you want to say or anything you want to promote?
Absolutely not. I'm just very happy to be here. I hope this is useful to anyone. And thank you for being so kind.
No, thank you for sharing everything that you've shared. And thank you for your kindness, for your empathy, and for your teachings. Keep doing what you're doing. As an immigrant myself, I really admire you. And thank you for everything.